everyone. Welcome back to Diving Deeper. Took a little break for Thanksgiving, but we're back with our series where we're kind of diving into difficult parts of Scripture for those who are going through times of deconstruction or doubt, or just want to, think a little deeper about some of the easy answers that they were given that don't seem to be working anymore. Today we're going to start a little mini-series that we'll kind of come back to every now and then that I'm calling Troublesome Texts. So this is going to be where we look at a book or maybe just a story or passage from Scripture that maybe just doesn't sit right for various reasons. And the way that it's been explained to you before doesn't really actually seem to take care of all of the problems that really come up when you think deeply about it. And so to kick off this little series, we're going to be looking today at the book of Job. I talked a little bit about Job in our previous video when we were looking at the concept of Satan or the devil and kind of worked through how this character appears in this book. But it brings up a lot of other questions about what this book is about and what it's trying to do. And so the way I'm usually going to start with this series, these troublesome texts, is try and give the least generous reading of this book, or at least the way this passage or whatever we're looking at could maybe cause a lot of difficulties for us. And so, looking at the book of Job, one way you could look at this is it's a book about Satan convincing God to make a bet and ruin the life of a good, innocent man. And then one interpretation is Job just accepts this tragedy patiently and with humility, which is just not true if you read the whole book. But then to go on, it's actually about Job complaining until God shows up, and then God doesn't answer his legitimate questions and just kind of bullies Job into submission. But God doubles what he had at the beginning, including his children, so problem is solved. Everything's fine. Right? That is pretty problematic if that's what this book is about, and that's what the focus is. And there are ways in which that's all accurate, but we also, as we do in the series, can dive deeper into the meaning of Job. So maybe a good place to start is what this book is not about. Because the book of Job is not really about why bad things happen to good people. The only answer is it's because of God and Satan making bets, and I don't think we want to go too far into thinking that's always the case. It's also not really about how to be patient or trust or rejoice in times of suffering. You have the famous verse, the end of chapter 1, where Job says, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away." That is not representative of the whole book. There's a translation of the book of James 5:11 where it talks about the patience of Job, but that's kind of misleading. Job is not very patient. Endurance is a more common translation, and that's a little bit better. The book of Job is also not about how God fixes suffering, because it doesn't really seem to get fixed in a lot of ways. A lot of bad interpretations of what this book is about are really only based on the first couple chapters and the last chapter, and misses the meat, the majority of this book. Now, there are a lot of things that make the book of Job interesting or kind of unique. It has non-Israelite characters. It's not really clear when it's set. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The author is anonymous. That's actually more common than we sometimes assume. And the majority of the book is poetry. It's these series of arguments or debates between the characters. So when was this book written? What's the setting of it? I talked about this a little bit in the previous video as well, but the two main options, this is early, and the reasons for that is that it has unusual Hebrew that maybe seems archaic, so it could possibly be an earlier form of Hebrew. And it seems like it's set in the patriarchal period, the time of Genesis, because some of the tribes that are mentioned, like the Chaldeans, are from that time. The type of money, the fact that characters have very long lifespans, all seems like it's from that period. But the other option is that this book is from a later period, probably after the exile. And this is the view that I take, because you find actually some Persian terms, which would be from that period. It sometimes maybe seems like Aramaic form of Hebrew, which is also later, as we're going to talk about, including the figure of the accuser, or the Satan. Everything else we see with that character comes from the later period. And, thinking broadly, the theology of the book of Job seems to be responding to earlier, more simplistic views. Really responding to suffering and not having a very clear answer, that seems like a more mature, later reflection than an earlier black and white view, something we'll talk about a lot in this video. Now, as far as, that's when it was probably written. When did it happen? Well, I would say it's best to read this book more like a parable, right? If this is a parable, it's not a historical recording of events. Does that actually change anything or lessen it in any way? I would say, in fact, reading it as a parable helps. It takes away some of the major problems in the depiction of what God is presented as doing here. And so the focus is not about when it happened or where or if. The focus is the questions that this book raises. Now, the structure of the book, like I kind of mentioned, it has this prologue that we're probably familiar with. And then the majority of it are these poetic arguments between the different characters. It's almost like a legal drama or a play. Job is making his case against God. Job's friends come in and make a defense, respond to Job, and then finally God takes the stand at the end. And then you have this prose epilogue. It works well as a dramatic reading. That's how I've done it when I've taught this book, but we don't have time to do that, and it's just me, so that makes it a lot less exciting. But there's a very clear structure and this very big division between the majority poetry in the middle and the little prose bookends. But we do have to start with those bookends, with the prologue. And so at the very beginning, we're introduced to Job, and he's kind of the epitome of the wise, righteous man. If you read other wisdom literature like Proverbs, this is the kind of person you're supposed to be. And being like Job is supposed to make you live an incredibly blessed life. So it says, there once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. The man was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. And then it goes on to list all of his possessions that he has. But this is the worldview, the mindset where it starts. Job lives right, he's blameless, and so he is blessed. And I think the implied assumption here, it's not totally stated, but the assumption that we're probably meant to make is the reason for his blessing, the reason he has so much wealth and possessions and a good family, is because he's a good person, because he is righteous and blameless. Those two things go together in the worldview that I think is really up for debate that's being discussed in this book. And so then we cut and move to this scene in kind of the heavenly throne room. It talks about the sons of God, or heavenly beings, coming and reporting to Yahweh, the Lord. And it's, again, this idea of God being a king. He's holding court and hearing from these various different members of that court. And one of them is the accuser. Like I said, go and watch our previous video that I really dig into all of that. The main takeaway is that this is a title. It's not a proper name, Satan. The Hebrew word Satan just means accuser, and that's this character's role here. He's part of this court. It's not seen as problematic that he's present in heaven. So this is a pretty early development in the stages of this idea of an evil figure, a figure who is accusing God's people. Here, this accuser's role is really like a prosecuting attorney or a spy master. But really, even in the book of Job, it's very clear that what happens to Job is God's responsibility. The book is not putting all of the blame on the devil or some evil figure. In fact, if you read through the story, God is the one who brings Job up first. He's like, hey, have you considered my servant Job? He's great. He does everything right. And then when, the Satan is suggesting, the accuser says, well, it's only because you're protecting him that he's, serving you. God is the one who signs off on this suffering that is inflicted on him. And then the accuser, very importantly, does not show up for the rest of the book. Job is not blaming this figure. He doesn't get mentioned at the end when God shows up. And so in Job, the explanation for suffering, for why bad things happen to good people, can't just be, well, it's because of the devil. This book is really putting the blame on God in some way, but we're going to see it is kind of troubling the way that is or really isn't resolved in the end. But it does bring up this good question. Does the accuser have a point here? Does Job fear God, revere God for nothing? I think one of the purposes of this book, and where it does have value, even though it's sometimes troubling, is to make us question, how do we use religion for self-gain? When are we serving God because of what we'll get out of it? Are you only doing good because you think that'll get you into heaven someday? Very often that's the way that the gospel is presented. It's just a ticket out, and all you have to do is make sure you say the right prayer, do the right practices, and then not do anything to lose that status. But at the end of the day, it is pretty much about, what am I going to get out of it? Any good that I do is for that purpose. And Job, as we're going to see, I think is trying to push back against that idea a little bit. And so in the rest of the prologue, as we know, Job has a couple very bad days. He loses his flocks, he loses his home, he loses his children, right? So we're not just talking about wealth and possessions, although in the ancient world, children were a little more like possessions in some ways. But it's coming from all directions. It's this kind of just a picture of complete destruction. It's almost funny the way that one servant comes in and says, everything was taken away and the only one that lasts, that made it out. But Job famously doesn't curse God, at least in this initial moment. There's a second scene with the accuser, who then is allowed to physically hurt Job. Then you have Job's wife coming in, encouraging him basically to end his life. And in a sense, I don't want to villainize her too much. She maybe just doesn't want to see her husband suffer anymore. But she is kind of echoing the accuser, saying, why honor God? Why be faithful if you're not getting anything out of it? But Job won't die. He's not going to do that. But I think it's really because he wants answers, right? He's just too stubborn to give up now. But of course, then we have the famous response at the end of the chapter I referenced earlier, where he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, the narrator says Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Now, that is not the whole of Job's response. I've seen plenty of people use Job as this kind of model character, using those two verses. I think it's pretty easy to say, if you read through the rest of the book, Job does charge God with wrongdoing with a lot of things, as we're going to see. And so it's really all just setting up, these first couple of chapters are setting up this big question of, why do people worship God? What makes God worthy of worship? Is it because God is powerful? Is it because God is good? Is it because God is just? Those are the kind of questions that are circling around here. Does God's universe creation function with justice or not? Are there times when it doesn't work out that way? Now, we're not going to read much of the main part of the book. Again, I just need to emphasize that is where the majority of this book is. It's over 40 chapters, and most of it is these poetic debates. But a lot of it is Job debating with these three friends, and then one other figure that comes in towards the end. And now the friends come and they sit quietly with him at first, but then once Job starts complaining, they kind of speak up and are trying to defend God in a sense, and are speaking against what Job is saying. And that makes me think of a lot of the, I would say, bad Christian responses to tragedy that we often hear. Maybe you've heard some of these things, or maybe you've said them, and hopefully can see how they aren't always helpful, right? Things like, well, everything happens for a reason. This is all just part of God's plan. Every single thing that happens, good or bad, no, it's all for a good purpose. Sometimes people say God needed another angel, as if God is needy, or misunderstanding the idea that angels and humans are separate creatures. Sometimes people will say, well, God was just trying to teach you a lesson. They're not necessarily saying that as a bad thing, although teaching a lesson usually doesn't sound too great. Another common bad response is, well, you just be thankful that it's not this. And then they list something that's worse, as if to say, or, well, at least, you still have this. The idea being, well, you shouldn't feel bad about this because other people have it worse. There's always something that could be worse about it. Not letting people feel the feelings or, call what happened to them a negative experience. And so there's a lot of bad responses like that from his friends throughout these chapters here. One of them, Eliphaz, says, who being innocent has ever perished? I'll put all these references down here. One of them says, God is disciplining you, right? God is trying to teach you a lesson. They emphasize that God is just. Maybe God is being merciful, right? He could have done more than what God did. There's this idea they present of, well, tradition is on our side. Everybody knows that this is why bad things happen, and that it's the wicked being punished, right? Their assumption is, well, Job, you and or your children must have sinned. That is the only explanation for why these bad things are happening, because bad things happen to bad people. It's always been this way. That is always the way the world works. It's just very black and white in their mindset. Job constantly is declaring his innocence, which we know from that prologue is true, but they just can't accept that because that doesn't fit their theology. Instead, one of them at one point says human beings are just like worms, a viewpoint that sometimes still comes across in a lot of Christian theology, that we're just worthless, we're terrible, we deserve the worst all of the time, and so any time that we're not getting that, that's actually a nice benefit. That's mercy. So where are these friends getting this theology? I called it bad, but it comes from the Bible. Now, the characters in the story, since it's set in the patriarchal period, the time of Genesis, technically they wouldn't have read, the law of Moses, the Hebrew law, but it does feel like that's what the author is responding to. Like I said, it's actually probably from a much later date. And so, mostly in the book of Deuteronomy, this is sometimes called Deuteronomistic theology. It's also often present in the book of Proverbs. It's this very clear idea that if you do right, you will be blessed. And if you do wrong, you'll be cursed. The end of Deuteronomy is very famous for this, with its list of blessings in chapter 30 and much longer list of curses in chapter 28. And Proverbs 22, 28, for example, say that faithfulness is rewarded with riches. It's this very clear idea that if you are a good, faithful follower of God, that'll come back to you in a monetary way. Proverbs and Deuteronomy talk about the idea of divine discipline. Psalm 37, also sometimes part of this wisdom tradition, says that the righteous don't suffer, right? I think that verse says, I have never seen a righteous person go hungry, as if to say, so that can't happen. And then on the other side, Proverbs very often will say the wicked will die, they'll suffer, they'll reap what they sow. And it's this very clear, cut and dry way that things always work. Now, this theology is biblical, and there are ways in which it is helpful. It is the idea of karma in that sense, of reaping what you sow. Your actions have consequences. It is generally true. It's generally true that if you live your life in a way that doesn't hurt others, that isn't hurting yourself, that isn't selfish, your life is going to be better. And that if all of your relationships, you're just very self-centered, you're always trying to get what you can, no matter who you step on, that tends to have negative consequences. The point, though, is that it's not always that way. Deuteronomy and these three friends in the book of Job, it has to be that way all the time. And in their worldview, the only possible answer to why Job is suffering is because Job sinned. There can't be anything else. His experience is irrelevant. What he says he's done or not done, it doesn't matter. Again, that's why the prologue is here and why it's so important. It establishes Job's innocence. God said at the outset, no, this person is blameless. Because, well, without that, the friends, and I think a lot of people that are reading it would have to assume, well, this guy must have done something terrible to deserve what's happened to him. And Job responds to his friends by trying to constantly point to his experience. He says early on, it seems you're just afraid of my suffering, right? That I think a lot of these responses, whether from Job's friends or some of these common Christian responses, is a response from fear because, well, this doesn't fit my very airtight theology. And so I can't handle what you're actually saying. I'm just going to respond with what I think has to be true. He tells them, when life is good, when things are easy, it's easy to look down on people that are suffering and just judge them, which is what they're doing. He asks them to put themselves in his shoes. What if I were in your place? Don't you think I could be sympathetic to a friend? He also kind of says, you don't know what's going on in my life. If I had any sin, which I don't, that would be my business. And then just constantly pleading for them to have some pity, which they don't. Now, importantly, at the very end of the book, when God shows up, he says the friends are wrong. They didn't speak truly about them. Job has not sinned. The world is not as simple as they imagine. Now, we're going to get to what God says to Job and how that's also not everything that we would like. But it's important that God says straight up, these friends were wrong to assume that he had to be a sinner for him to suffer like this. I think the question for us is, do we allow for human experience? Or do we judge what must be true based on the general truths that we have already accepted? An important lesson of Job is to listen to the suffering and maybe just shut up sometimes. The only good things the friends do at the very beginning is to sit in silence and weep with him. Once they open their mouths, that's when they get in trouble, and that's often the case for us, right? We don't know what to say in times of tragedy, but sometimes it's better to say nothing at all than to say something that ends up being harmful. Jesus, in response to tragedy, as again I mentioned before, he doesn't take the simplistic, well, this person must have sinned. That's why he was born blind. That's why the tower fell on these people. Jesus acknowledges that it's not always that clear, but we can still respond with compassion. And, this idea today of the prosperity gospel, the idea that if you live right, you'll be blessed with health and wealth. It's very common. You see plenty of televangelists that preach it. It sounds nice, but in our lived experience, it just doesn't ring true. It puts too much blame on the people that suffer as the reason for their suffering. You didn't have enough faith. You're doing some sort of sin that maybe you don't even realize. But there are better ways to respond to those tragedies. And hopefully we can have a little bit more humility. And that's a way that Job can be a helpful book. Even as we're about to move into the conversation about God, the book of Job is still a little bit troubling. Okay, so what is this book saying about God? Now, like I mentioned, the prologue where we're seeing the scene in heaven is mostly there to show us that Job truly is innocent. God knows that, and so what the friends say is not accurate. And we're not clear exactly on the development of the book of Job, but one common theory is that the poetic section was first, and then this prose section was added over time to kind of help explain and set everything up. And I have to be honest, one of the reasons that we're talking about Job as a troublesome text is I'm still wrestling with Job's depiction of God. I struggle with it. I don't love the way God is depicted in this a lot. I think, again, it's better to read this as a parable than a literal historical event. It's wisdom literature. It doesn't really seem like it's meant to be historical. So that changes it a little bit, but we still have to wrestle with how God is depicted here. Now, Job's theology throughout the book, in contrast to how he appears in that very first chapter and what he says, he is very upfront with God, with what he wants, what he thinks God has done or not done, and what God should do. And he very commonly, this book, a lot of it is framed as like a court case. So it's like Job is suing the Lord for what the Lord has done to him. But he says, for example, God won't give me a hearing. Even if I could get him to come talk to me, he wouldn't really hear me out, which is in some ways true at the end. And so Job constantly is pointing out, in contrast to his friends, no, it's not always that simple. Both the blameless and the wicked are destroyed. Sometimes even the wicked succeed. All right. Again, we're talking about experience. Have you ever seen any instances where someone who's clearly done wrong continues to, amass more power and wealth and influence through their life, right? We know that's true, unfortunately. He talks about God is testing him in some sense, and in some sense, maybe that's true. But he just says at one point, God just does whatever he pleases, and that can be taken in a positive way, that God is going to do what's right, or it can be just God can do whatever God wants and nobody can call him on it. And that seems to be more the view that Job is taking through this. But he will say over and over, God has denied me justice. This is not just. This is not right. And, I'm a little bit inclined to agree. This isn't really fair, what happens to Job. And so, what Job wants, and I think what we want, at least what I would want, is for God to come in and give an explanation and maybe make a defense of how this is just, or how this fits, or why things work the way that they do. And so after all these chapters of Job complaining and making his case, God finally takes a stand, so to speak. But the way that God shows up, he shows up in this whirlwind. It's very impressive and kind of scary. Most of what God does through this conversation is just ask these rhetorical questions of, where were you when I did this? And so it'll talk a lot about creation, when things were made, when things were set up. Where was Job in all of that? No, he wasn't there. And so, for example, God says, do you know the laws of heaven? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Do you send lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you? Here we are, right? The implication being, no, you weren't part of that, but I was. So I know what's going on here. There's a couple times Job speaks up and says, okay, I get it. But then God responds, brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? So God's justice is in some ways up for debate, even if most of what God talks about is more how God has created all things, and that gives God more responsibility than maybe Job is giving him credit for. And so after this, Job is kind of shut down. It's just all these questions over and over that Job knows he can't really respond to. And so he says in chapter 42 to God, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. I have indeed spoken of things I didn't understand, wonders beyond my comprehension. My ears had heard about you, and now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I relent and find comfort on dust and ashes. I'm not totally satisfied with that response because God's power is not what is up for debate. It's about God's justice. And yet that's what God mostly talks about. God is emphasizing his power in creation. And Job has said, no, God can do whatever he pleases, but does he do things in a just way? Now, that final verse that Job says there, the translation of it is really difficult, and so a lot of translations will probably have footnotes. Some will say that Job is repenting here, as if he's admitting he was wrong. I don't think that is necessarily the way you have to read it, and I don't think that that's the way you should. He says in that translation he relents, right? It's like, okay, I'm not going to debate anymore. But that's not the same as him admitting any wrongdoing here. And ultimately, God doesn't say that he sinned in what he said, even with all of that. Even if I wish, he could have gotten more answers. And so, I don't have an easy explanation for the book of Job. I think it is still a troublesome text, even as we've spent time with it here. On the one hand, there are ways in which I don't like the ending of Job, and I still struggle with it. I think God comes across as a bit of a bully, where instead of responding to some of the valid complaints that Job makes, he just hits him over and over with these questions, emphasizing his power, and doesn't give him a response. Why not just tell him this was a test? Why not tell him, oh, well, I just wanted to prove that you don't just serve me because you get good things out of it, right? The first couple chapters give an easy explanation, and again, maybe that's part of that can be explained by the fact that those originally maybe weren't connected as much. Job may not understand everything about how all of creation functions, and he wasn't there in the beginning when all these things were created, but he was asking about that. Couldn't he understand his own situation? That's the thing he wants answers about. Isn't all that other stuff that God's done kind of irrelevant? God's ways can't be fully known, but shouldn't there be some sort of coherence? There's a difference in mystery and just chaos, because in Job's experience, that's what life seems to be, and it doesn't seem like God is addressing that. God doubling his possessions, including his children at the end, that doesn't fix everything. There's a sense in which I guess that is fair or just, but in a lot of ways, it's not. I would imagine that Job's relationship with God is always going to be different, and it's not just gone back to the way it was just because he got his stuff back. So there are ways in which it's still troubling, and yet there are things that I do appreciate about this book and about the ending. For one thing, we see that God meets us as we approach him. How you expect God to be is the God you'll experience. And so Job, while he was sincere, was very demanding, and he expected simple answers. Expects God to be like a judge, right? Like I mentioned, this book is like a court case, so maybe it's not surprising that the God who shows up is a bit judgy. That is not the only way that we can understand the nature of God. And so, if you think of God as a being who's just going to give you simple, easy answers and explain everything, well, you may not get what you want. I think there's also this idea, since God focuses so much on the creation, what happens when we contemplate that? When we contemplate our place in everything that exists. Now we know so much more about how expansive creation is. When you look at the stars and we know now that they've been around for billions of years, what is a human being in the scope of all of that? It can, in a positive sense, create this sense of awe and wonder, right? We don't look at all of that and say, oh, okay, now everything makes perfect sense. It is this sense of our smallness, this idea that it's beyond our possibility to understand it all. And so that does lead to a positive sense, possibly, of humility. Right, so I think Job can help us here in seeing this sense, finding the sense of awe and wonder. I personally would have preferred a more pastoral tone from the Good Shepherd here, but like I said, when we think about how, as Psalm 8 says, when we consider the works of God's hands, what are we that God cares about us at all? This is a God who does show up. He doesn't give Job the answer he might want, but he does show up. And sometimes, hey, maybe that's all that we would want, even if we don't get the answers, to know that we've been heard, to know that God is there. Again, it inspires a sense of awe at our place in this universe that God has created. And I recognize that this is a message that works in the larger kind of macro sense, but it still can often be difficult in the smaller micro sense, right? Okay, yes, in general, thinking about the vastness of creation is good, but what about Job's particular suffering? And what about my particular suffering? Because that's really what we're asking about here. We can probably do another video about the problem of evil, why bad things happen to good people. We're not going to get a complete, solid answer to that. I'll just tell you now. But it does remind us that faith, in some sense, is letting go of the need for certainty. If you have certainty, you don't need faith. And so faith is always going to have some sense of unknown, of not being certain about why things happen a certain way. So there's some sense in which the book of Job would work better if it didn't have that prologue, if he'd somehow had lost everything and he's saying all these things about it, because that gives us a certainty that we don't often have in life, right? Like Job, we don't know what's going on in the spiritual realm in the heavens that might be leading to our suffering. And so we're most often in his shoes, not knowing those things. I've quoted this, I don't know how many times, but Richard Rohr says that the most common paths to transformation are great love and great suffering. Now, I wish there were a little bit more divine love in the book of Job, but we find that in other places. But both great love and great suffering, they break down our barriers, they break down our ego, they break down our black and white explanations, and hopefully can open us up to mystery. That may not always be what we want, and the appeal to mystery can sometimes be a cop-out. I acknowledge that, but sometimes that is the mark of mature, true faith. Finding the ways that what we thought we knew about the way the world works, what we thought we knew about God, well, maybe it's not that simple. I think that actually is a sign of spiritual growth. So, we can make an appeal to mystery here. Again, beware people who claim that the book of Job is a simple book about patience or why bad things happen to good people. It's not. Really, I think it demonstrates the three stages of faith, of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction, or orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. Right? We start with this black and white construction where certainty is expected. We think we have it. God is good and rewards goodness 100% of the time in a way that you can take to the bank. But then we often experience a time of disorientation. We're deconstructing those early easy answers because now they fall short. We're not certain of anything at all. God's goodness and fairness and justice are totally in question. But then hopefully we can come to a place of reconstruction. We don't go back to how it was before, but we come somewhere new where we can stop seeking certainty and we can be comfortable with mystery. Again, it doesn't solve everything with the book of Job, but I think it can point us in that direction. And as always, we want to look at Job, like we look at everything, through the lens of Christ, through his story and what we see there. What was Christ's response to suffering? He didn't respond to it with bullying answers. He endured it himself. That is where we actually see God in God's fullness, is being willing to endure the worst of what we can do to one another. And so Christ meets us in it. Christ is comfortable with that mystery. Christ can find new life. Life can come out of those times of loss. But the loss is reality. It's not all just a simple, straightforward path. And yet Christ is in all of that. So, thanks for joining me today as we've looked at one troubling text. We'll look at another soon, and we'll see you next time for more Diving Deeper.